Hello and welcome to the Irish History Show. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. Or if you'd like to follow us on Twitter, we're at Irish History Pod. You can also follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. Now, on this episode, we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Pádraig Lenihan. Dr. Pádraig Lenihan lectures in NUI Galway, and he's an expert in early modern Irish history, and also what we're going to be talking about today, siege warfare in the 17th century in Ireland.
Hi, Pádraig. John here.
John, how are you?
Good. Thanks for joining us, Pádraig. Pádraig, I have a great quote from one of your books here from a 17th century writer, I think. We make war more like foxes than lions, and you will have 20 sieges for one battle. And why was that true back in the 17th century in Europe in general and in Ireland in particular?
If I could begin with the pre-gunpowder siege, if you like, for want of a better word, a medieval siege. Before you have gunpowder, a siege is literally, the French word, it comes from the French word sitting down, a siege. An army sits down in front of a castle and it waits and it waits and it waits. So the medieval castle is strong because it is high. The walls are thin, but the walls are high. It's to deter somebody climbing over it, or if you want a term of art, is to deter escalade. Now that changes radically with the invention of gunpowder. That's a game changer. We see most notably the fall of the Roman Empire, the fall of Constantinople in 1453. It succumbs. Walls that had survived for a millennium at this stage, longer than a millennium at this stage, have succumbed to gunpowder. So it really does change. We see it in the 1530s in Ireland with the capture of Maynooth by Lord Deputy Skeffington. So gunpowder changes everything, or does it? In the medium term, defenders respond to this challenge by making a new kind of fortification. Instead of having high, thin walls, you've got low, thick ramparts, earth, rubble, stone facing. The problem with doing that is that if you've got a thick wall, you can't look over it. There are blind spots. So you have to have other portions of the fortification sticking out or projecting, called bastions, so that people on other parts of the wall can see your part of the wall and you can see theirs. So it's a mutually interlocking fields of fire. That means by the 17th century, the balance of strength has come back again to the defender. So it takes an awful long time to settle down, to actually capture a town. An example from Western Europe would be the Spanish siege of Ostend about halfway through their 80 Years' War. That took from 1601 to 1604. The Spanish won. And if you could see me, I'm putting inverted commas around the one. The one, but it was a Pyrrhic victory. My favorite for longevity is the siege of a place called Candia or Heraklion in Crete, held by the Venetians, besieged by the Ottomans, and that lasted from 1648 to 1669. Now that's a siege. So the balance, if you like, is with the defender. Now, in the 17th century, the second half, that changes again. So I'm getting there, John. I'm getting to why the Irish siege, what is happening against this backdrop. The changes from the long siege to something that is much quicker. Why are besiegers able to do what they need to do so much more quickly? They deploy more men. The French, when they're taking Namur in 1692, Namur is a city in what we now call Wallonia or Walloon, French-speaking Belgium. They have 6 times as many people attacking as are defending. So you use an awful lot more men, you use an awful lot more firepower. Classically, by the time of the War of the Spanish Succession, the first decade and a half of the 18th century, besiegers have 300 guns and mortars. So you're looking at more guns, more mortars, and different kinds of firepower. Instead of just looking at the gun, which is following a solid shot, which knocks a hole in the wall, makes what we call a breach. You have different kinds of artillery. You have artillery firing ricochet fire on a half charge and a high elevation, which kind of bounces around inside in the ramparts. You have mortars, which instead of firing, they fire a thing called a bomb or a bombshell, a hollow sphere filled with shrapnel, filled with explosives. That's an anti-personnel weapon. So you've got different kinds of weapons. You've got more firepower. You've got more men, and above all, you've got system. And it's a system we need to understand. We associate this with a man called Vauban. Now, Vauban was Louis XIV's siege master and the engineer, and he systematizes the process of the siege in form. Your problem is, if you've got a wall, you've got an enemy fortification, is getting your guns close enough to the wall or the rampart to knock a gap in it. And you can't obviously drag them across open ground. So you do is you burrow along under the ground. You dig trenches, and you dig trenches in zigzags or doglegs because you don't want to be subject to enfilade fire. You drive these trenches forward, a number of them, one or more. You connect them by parallels, and you do so systematically until you get the trenches right up to the edge of the enemy fortifications. And classically, by this stage, the edge of the enemy fortification will be working from the outside in. You've got an open fire-swept zone, glacis sloping. You've got a palisade, palings. You've got a breastwork, a chest-high depression. Behind that, you've got a walkway. Behind that, you've got a ditch. Behind that, you've got a rampart. Behind that, you've got another walkway. Behind that, you've got a wall. You've got multiple levels. So you would touch the outer layer of the toughened outer skin, which is often called the covered way. So you bring your trenches right up to that, to within the distance that a grenadier, and this is a new kind of siege, that's his job. He's associated with sieges primarily. The grenadier lobs a grenade. It's a relatively new invention, which is a small, I suppose, a reduced mortar bomb. It's a hollow shell packed with explosives and nasty stuff, bits of shrapnel. He throws this over the palisades or what's left of it, charges through them, and they will make a little fort or lodgement, as it's called, on the covered way. And that should be that. By this stage, the old idea of knocking a hole in the walls or a breach in the ramparts, it's going out because nobody wants that to happen. The defenders, if it comes to that, and if the enemy troops make a breach, and if they pour into it, the danger is they're going to run amok. You're going to have a Magdeburg or a Drogheda or something like that on your hands. You need to avoid that, and the defender needs to recognize, okay, these guys have established themselves on the covered way. The next step, they can knock a hole in the breach, or knock a breach rather in the ramparts. Do I need to wait for that to happen, or should I capitulate now? So it's almost like a theatrical performance. It's got its opening act, its entr'acte, its act 1, act 2, act 3, and both parties are operating off the same script. To answer your question at last, why are sieges so important compared to battles? Some would argue it's because armies tend to be a little battle shy. And it's and partly to do with the nature of war, certainly in Europe, Western Europe. They're not total wars. They're not wars in which a state is setting out to destroy, usually, another state. They're wars in which they're trying to nibble away a bit of territory at the expense of their neighbours. You bite that territory, you hold it by putting fortifications on it. They try and get it back to you. You're not primarily interested in taking the risk of facing the enemy main field army because, well, you could lose. Whereas siege is a much more methodical, predictable way of fighting. So the siege is important for that respect. But above all, sieges are important because towns and cities are very important.
Well, yeah, thanks for getting out to that, Pádraig, because that was my exact next question. Just on that, I mean, how is a town organized at this period of time? Because it's pretty well organized in Europe, a town or city, right?
Yes, I mean, towns and cities. You see, Europe. Well, let's get in context, I suppose. First of all, Europe is overwhelmingly rural. Even the most urbanized part of Europe, the Low Countries or Lombardy, for example, they're still predominantly rural. But nonetheless, so towns and cities are, they're important because they're centers of wealth, of what you might call liquid wealth, of cash. Trading goes on there, the exchange of goods. If you're waging war or you're raising taxes, towns are the wealth generators. Whereas trying to extract money from the countryside, from farmers, then and now, is very difficult. Towns are centers of wealth, they're center of manufacture, they dominate their hinterland, and they occupy strategically important places. Almost by definition, towns are in places that armies want to be. They occupy bridges, river crossings, ports, prosperous hinterlands, so they occupy strategic ground. Now, these towns in Europe traditionally are set apart from the countryside. If you take the feudal countryside, there's a German saying, Stad, Luft, macht free. And the Stad is a city, the Luft is the air, macht makes, and free is free. In other words, a serf who escapes from the countryside, if he makes it to, or she makes it to the town, they are free. This town is separate from, they strive to be separate from the jurisdictionally from the countryside. They run themselves. And if you take the English and by extension Irish example, a town or borough will have its founding charter. It'll have a mayor. It'll have a common council. It will have a franchise, more or less wide or narrow. I mean, most of these common councils can be controlled by a very small number, a small clique of families, the so-called tribes in Galway. I mean, if you take the Irish example, you've got your Frenches and your Lynches and your Bodkins and your Kerwins in Galway, but you also have their equivalents in Limerick, your Arthurs and your Roaches. But you know what I mean. So you got self-replicating mercantile elite. They're separate from the countryside. They tend to look more towards Dublin Castle and towards London rather than the countryside. So they're more English in that sense. They're little jurisdictional islands of themselves. They're a kind of a world set apart. Their own mayor, their own government, their own liberties. They're responsible for their own taxes. They raise money by charging, for example, if I want to cross the bridge of Athlone, that's the money raiser there. Sydney's bridge built in the 1570s. Well, I have to pay a toll on the bridge, and that goes to the municipal government. Well, it actually doesn't in the case of Athlone. It goes into the pocket of the Hancocks. But anyway, so the town is set apart, and the visual, if you like, expression of that apartness is the town walls. And almost by definition, all of these towns have a circuit of walls. And those walls, you can't say the bigger the town footprint, the bigger the town's population. Some towns have very large footprints with walls that encompass quite a lot of empty space or gardens. Others are tighter, but they all have walls.
Well, as you mentioned there, Pádraig, with the walls, and some of them are bigger or smaller, it must be something that they must have to take into account, that if there is warfare on the town, they will have to take in some of the town's residents that live outside the city walls or the town walls.
That is an intriguing question, all right. Usually in the context of a siege, you're going to have refugees from the surrounding hinterland taking shelter within the walls. I'll give you the example of Derry, 1689, the siege of Derry. That was a long one, April, May, June, into July 25th, 1689. There are certainly in excess of 20,000 people inside in that town during the siege. That's between militiamen, locally raised troops, women and children. Now, there are not 20,000 inhabitants of that town, and it's still very much a town. I would hesitate. I'm going to stick my neck out there and say there's probably maybe a quarter of that population Less, even one-fifth of that would be the normal pre-war population. So they are expanding. But you asked the question, do they allow for it? Well, they don't, you see. This is the problem. The problem is you've got towns that are, if the siege goes on a long time, that are grossly overcrowded. So what sort of problems then do you arise? You come up with problems of, I suppose, physical shelter from the elements, water supply, clean water supply. And that's going to be difficult because so many people are using, how do I put this delicately, septic tanks and privy pits and whatnot can be overused or overflow, contaminate the water supply. So that's a problem. So to answer your question, they don't actually allow for the presence of a large number of refugees coming in from the countryside. Not only from the countryside, I forgot to mention, but from the suburbs. Every town has an area of suburbs. It's outside the urbs or beyond the walls. And the first thing, Siege Work 101, first thing you do if you're threatened with a siege is you knock down the suburbs, because you don't want the enemy to be close to the walls. You want to have open ground outside the walls. So all the people who are living in the suburbs, they also have to take shelter. And if you take the example, I'm familiar with Galway, where I am speaking from, the suburbs on every side, on the landward side, what I think of as the eastern side of the Corrib, those suburbs are at least as big. They're bigger than the area of the town proper. So if you like, the population of Galway or any of these towns would double just with its own suburban population, not to mention the people coming in from the countryside.
And there's even cases, Pádraig, isn't there, in sieges where useless eaters are expelled from the town and then the besiegers drive them back in?
Oh, yes. In the case of the siege, for most of the period we're looking at, and I'll be giving you specific examples in a minute, but the siege that involves a prolonged starving out or blockade of the defenders, a lot of sieges end up that way. And in that case, the more people that are stuck inside the city, the better, because the quicker the defenders will eat through their provisions. So you want, if you're an attacker, you want them to keep their so-called useless mouths with them in the town. That's to say women and children and non-combatants. And naturally, they will try and expel their useless mouths, particularly if they're people who are not from the town, if they're people who've come in from the countryside. Will you try and push them out? And you, as a besieger, will try and stop that. So a good example would be the 1650-51 siege of Limerick, or the 1651 siege, rather, the second one, where it's a sad story. I mean, a man and his daughter escape from the town and they're captured by the English, and Ireton, he hangs them. And he hangs, and even though the man in question says, look, hang me and let my daughter back into the town. And he hangs them because he wants to discourage others from leaving the town. An example of the opposite behavior, and again, it was considered foolishly indulgent at the time, is at the Siege of Derry, where Richard Hamilton, who's operating the Jacobite blockade or Siege of Derry, he lets quite a number of people who had fled into the city from the hinterland of Raphoe and the Lagan, he lets them back home again. It gives them wants to give a written undertaking that they'll behave themselves, and that's considered by his critics to be ridiculously, naively indulgent. And so yes, the question of how many people are in the town is of vital interest to a besieger.
I suppose, Pádraig, we should put in context as well when we're dealing with Ireland in the 17th century, the amount of warfare that goes on and the amount of civilians that are killed. It's really shocking when you're looking back.
Well, Ireland's 17th century, you're looking at the aftershocks of the 9 Years' War, which ends in 1603. You're looking at the absolutely catastrophic 1641 to 1653 war. Do you call it the Confederate and Cromwellian Wars, or the Wars of Religion? We're not even quite sure what to call it. And then there's the 1689-91 shorter, quite large-scale war the Williamite or Jacobite wars, or the Cogandori or the Cogantriri, or however you call it, those are wars that are enormously, certainly the middle one is very destructive. Both of them, and the 9 Years' War. The latter part of the 9 Years' War sees the Tudor forces using, because they can't get to grips with the Irish, they can't get to grips with Tyrone's, with O'Neill's army. So what they do is they destroy the crops, the animals, the peasants that would shelter them and feed them, the villages that would shelter them, and they wage war indirectly against Tyrone, against his base, and that's by waging war. They kill. I mean, Chichester, who's no softy himself, he talks about coming back from an expedition across Lough Neagh, and he's killed so many churls that he's, what's the word he puts it, that he's almost weary of it. Likewise, in the latter part of the Cromwellian conquest, let's say the 1650, 51, 52 into 53, those last years are enormously costly on the civilian population, precisely for that reason, that the Irish or the Royalists aren't able to put armies into the field to fight the Cromwellians in the open, so they resort to guerrilla warfare. And the counterinsurgency response to guerrilla warfare is to destroy the people who feed the guerrillas. And by that, again, we're back to the same stratagem. And sadly, in both cases, that stratagem works very well in the long run and at enormous cost. The Jacobite or Williamite War is not as costly. Yes, there are rapparees. Yes, there is guerrilla activity, but it doesn't last as long. And the war is wrapped up with the Treaty of Limerick much more quickly than when you're looking at 1689, 1991. You're really looking at only 3 years of full-scale warfare.
Pádraig, we're going to talk about specific examples of sieges, but before we do, I want to talk about a sadly topical aspect of this siege warfare, which is disease. And how does disease impinge on siege warfare in this period?
It impinges on both besiegers and besieged, because if a besieger is waiting, he is going to be in a camp. He's going to have problems with water supply. He doesn't even have, he has houses or bodies or huts. So he's going to be stuck, shelter, water supply, sewerage. I seem to be obsessed with that, but that's a constant problem. And within the towns, you're going to have overcrowding. You're going to have more. The town is going to have more of an infrastructure in the sense of it has houses with roofs on them. It at least has that. It has some rudimentary procedure for sanitation and rules governing it. How does disease arise then? Basically, disposal of sewerage and animal manure and horse manure and so on. It doesn't happen. So if maybe at the most you're going to get are dung pits or manure pits, or not pits but heaps. They attract flies in huge numbers. Any account of sieges, particularly in everywhere, will literally talk. They use the analogy of clouds. You talk about men lying in hospital sick, and there's almost a moving mask of flies on their face. There's so many there. Those flies are going, and you can imagine all the bristles and hairs on a fly. So it's in the manure pit or on the manure heap, and it then goes and alights on your bit of grub, and very persistently will do so. So there's an immediate transmission of disease via that vector. That's one disease. So invariably, soldiers and civilians suffer from what's called flux, diarrhea. Now that can be bloody flux, that's to say flux with blood in it, or something like dysentery. That's the commoner garden sickness. It can also be caused by water. And it's impossible to tell the difference between, at this stage, typhoid fever and bloody flux, because the symptoms, they both have fever. The symptoms, even though the causes are different, the symptoms are the same. In the case of contaminated water, that's going to be another vector. So people are sick with a disease that is of itself not invariably fatal. I mean, you're looking at We know how difficult it is nowadays to calculate mortality rates for the present epidemic. Can you imagine how difficult it was, our difficulties in the past? But if you would say 10-15% of people afflicted by flux or bloody flux particularly are going to die. The significance of that is that while they are sick, they can then, particularly in cold, as the weather turns to autumn, they can pick up another disease, which is a really big killer, which is typhus. Now, typhus is a disease wherever you have the cold, the poor, the hungry, the undernourished, the demoralized, they huddle together for warmth, where basically normal standards of self-care break down. With typhus, that person becomes, in the context of close confines, the louse moves from the person who's either, if the person gets a high fever or if they die, the louse moves from that person to somebody with a temperature that they prefer, and they live in people's clothing, not in the bodies as such, and they move from person to person. So if you've got the close contact of a tent, a hut, a hospital, where people who are laid low with sickness, then typhus, or as it's often called, camp fever, jail fever, ship fever, workhouse fever. You can see the various carceral or constrained contexts. Typhus is another disease that we associate with the early modern siege. Typhus, certainly in excess of 50%, maybe more, of people who have typhus die. So it's much deadlier than flux in that sense. Not as deadly as plague, but fortunately for all of the period under review, plague is generally retreating. I think the last episode of plague in Ireland is in 1650. Galway 1649, Dublin and everywhere else 1650. That's it. In London, it's the plague of, is it 1665 or 1664? 1666 or 65, the Great Plague. So it recedes. So we're looking mainly at fever, as it's called, typhus, or we'll call it camp fever, and bloody flux.
I'm thinking of very prominent victims of disease during sieges, like Henry Ireton, the parliamentarian commander, would be probably the most prominent, I think.
Yeah, what did Ireton get? The assumption, Ireton was at the siege of Limerick. That's the 1651 siege. And that's a good example of one of these really long drawn out. There had been an attempted siege in 1650. He had to break up that, and he came back the following year. So from June to October 1651, his army, he's got 20,000 plus men. They're sitting down. They've surrounded the County Clare side of Limerick and the County Limerick side, and they're sitting down, and basically they're waiting till these guys surrender. And what probably causes the surrender of the Irish is disease. Now, it's assumed, it's usually said that this was bubonic plague and that Ireton himself may have contracted it. I think it wasn't bubonic plague. I don't think it was, because I think the problem is that the term, it can be confused with typhus. And I think what's happening in 51, 52, and in the following years is actually typhus fever, our old friend. And that's probably what Ireton contracted as well, because it's no respecter of conditions within. It's as likely to break out in a siege camp as it is to break out in a besieged town. So that's probably the fever which did for Ireton. He died some days after the surrender or the capitulation of the city.
Pádraig, you'll have to indulge me a little bit here, because I'm gonna impose my my themes onto it rather than go kind of chronologically, if that's okay.
That's fine. That's fine, John. Yeah, I do my best to keep up with you.
All right, so I'm gonna ask some, as I said, some thematic kind of questions. So, like, the first one is the kind of sieges which are very short and sharp and are basically assaults. Can you give us a couple of examples of this, Pádraig?
I can give you 3 examples. And those are 3 examples, 2 of which worked and 1 of which didn't work. We'll take the classic one, of course, would be September 1649 and Drogheda. Drogheda hadn't been upgraded. It had old-fashioned medieval defences. Cromwell has 48-pounder siege guns. He knocks a breach in the southern part of the Drogheda is a town of two parts. There's a smaller part on the south of the Boyne and a larger part on the north. He attacks the southern part. He doesn't cut off the town. It's still open on the north of the Boyne to all appearances. He attacks the southern part, knocks a hole in the wall, sends his troops through the breach. I said a hole, a breach. When I talk about a breach, what do I mean? If you could imagine solid shot hitting a wall, what happens? Yes, they make a gap in the wall. They also make a ramp of rubble going through that gap. So we talk about people climbing through a breach or over a breach. They may be climbing, they may be walking, but more often they're going one hand on the ground, one hand catching a weapon, and they're pulling. So that's what I mean by entering a breach. He sends his troops through the breach the first time, they're beaten back with loss. He sends them through the second time, and the Irish are beaten back and they crack. And some of them flee to a nearby the Millmount. Others flee across the bridge. They don't knock down or defend the bridge over the Boyne, and the Cromwellians pursue them. That is a good example of Cromwell's favoured siege tactic, which is set up your guns, knock a breach, send your boys in, end of. It's short and sharp. He tries the same thing in Clonmel. That would be in 1650, the following year, April to May 1650. Bring up the guns, knock a breach in this case in the northern part of the walls, and he does so. But the defender, Hugh Dove O'Neill, builds what's called a retirade. Now, what I think has happened there, and I was looking at it in some detail, is that where he makes the gap opens out onto a street. And that street itself becomes a long laneway, at the end of which O'Neill has put artillery pieces. So as the attackers come into that breach, which is blocked off, the streets and the houses are blocked off on the sides. There are men behind parapets firing down into the breach. As they come into that killing pound, they're cut down. More come in, they're cut down. More come in, they're cut down. I keep saying that. The idea was that they would go in and open up the main gate. Cromwell is waiting with the main body at the main gate, and he's waiting and waiting. Eventually, the troops pull back. A second wave is sent in. The same thing happens again. So that kind of short, sharp attack sometimes works. When it works very well. When it doesn't work, as in this case, it's probably the heaviest losses he suffered in any encounter in England, Ireland, or Scotland throughout his entire military career. Now, it's not a disaster in the sense of Clonmel does surrender some days after that assault. O'Neill has run out of gunpowder. So in that sense, it's a costly success, but it's a win. And my final example is, of course, Limerick in 1690. And that famously was, it culminates in that kind of an assault. Now, it's not as crudely done as Cromwell's. There was some element of the siege and form, making trenches, setting up batteries. The siege of Limerick culminates in an assault through a breach in the Irish town. A narrow breach, maybe about 12 yards wide, and it's too narrow. It's too narrow because previously Patrick Sarsfield had blown up a lot of the gunpowder and that they needed to make a proper breach. But William sends his people into the breach, and the French governor, Boiselot, has built what he calls a retirade, which is again the same kind of thing that O'Neill built at Clonmel, which is an interior, a retrenchment. You're familiar with the Minister's Finance tell us to retrench. By retrench, we mean we're cutting back. And the original term of that is you've got a series of tranchées or cuttings, and you build trenches, as it were, behind the trenches. You retrench. And that's what a retrenchment or a retirade was. And again, Boiselot has that area covered with 3 guns, heavy guns. One of them is a 32-pounder, loaded with chain and case shot. and the attackers, or the leading elements, come into the pound, and they're flittered. Well, they very nearly got through it, because, as it happens, the Irish troops occupying it ran away, but another group happened to be nearby. It's a long story, but again, it's an example of the fairly unprepared, impetuous assault that turns out to be very costly. That day, William lost, I said, between dead and mortally wounded, 1,500 men. So that's the heaviest loss in action he suffered during the entire war. Now, the heaviest losses overall would have happened through disease at Dundalk, but that, as it was, is another story.
Yes, no, I've reading about Clonmel. It's such a fascinating battle, and one of the things that I think is interesting is that if you are in a town like Clonmel in a warfare situation like this, what is the psychological effect on the people within the town if they have heard of other towns falling, if they've heard of atrocities? What's the impact or the pressure to capitulate before the battle even begins?
There's always tension, Carl, between the civilians and the military. Almost invariably. Usually the civilians and the people, the influential, the property owners, the merchants, the members of the corporation, the common councillors, they will put pressure on the military governor to capitulate. And by capitulating, we mean not surrendering, but arranging some sort of deal with the besieger, whereby, you see, the civilians don't want the whole thing to end. They don't want the military governor, to fight to the bitter end, because they will pay the price for the bitter end. It could be in the form of a storm, or the longer the siege goes on, the less inclined the attacker will be to make you attractive concessions. So, for example, Limerick eventually surrenders or capitulates. When it surrenders in October 1651, because O'Neill is not prepared to surrender. The citizens of Limerick want to surrender, or most of them. Now, there's the mayor and the local bishop of Emly, and a few others are, if you like, hardliners, but most of the civilians want to surrender. And one of O'Neill's people, a guy called Captain Edmund Fennell, seizes a gate and occupies it with his own troops, and says to O'Neill, "You better talk to these people, or else I'm going to let them in." So yes, that tension exists, and yet the governor can't fall out with the civilians, because he needs them for supplies, he needs their goodwill, he needs them for reinforcements, he needs them for everything. So they're gone. Like, O'Neill had defended Clonmel, but he moved on, and now he's defending Limerick, and if he loses that, if and when, he'll move on somewhere else. But the civilians are stuck. So usually, Galway would be a good example. In Galway, the civilians win in the sense that they get, in May 1652, they get a very good deal from Charles Coote, who promises them their free exercise of their religion, and they can keep their property in the town, which, had it been observed, would have been a very good deal. But the English Parliament pulls the Coote had no authority to make that argument, so that, having got the town, to say that the Coote had no authority to make these concessions on their behalf, and they don't observe them. So there are tensions. To come back to your point, civilians, they're fearful. They want this to be over, but they want, at the same time, to extract some sort of guarantees or some sort of promises. Nobody's guarantees, but some sort of promises as to their lives, their property, and maybe even their religious and political rights.
And in Limerick in 1690, which you've talked about, Pádraig, King William's failed assault on the walls of Limerick, famously the town's men and women came out to help the combatants and threw missiles at the assaulting troops.
I hate, as a historian, being the person who's puncturing the balloon of folklore. I'd say that much. I often wondered for years, where did this story of the women being on the walls? But in fact, I did find there are two contemporary references to women folk on the walls. One from a man called Lawrence White. He wrote a Latin poem of the siege. And another, I think, Story talks about it as well, Reverend George Story. The Governor Boiseau had more troops than he had weapons. Most of his troops, many of them had lost their weapons at the Battle of the Boyne. So he has lots of his troops along the wall with piles of rocks and stones, which are very surprisingly effective weapons if you're 20 foot up and you throw them down on top of, if you can imagine 3,000 men who are jammed elbow to elbow below. It's like people trying to come out after a crowded football match or something, and they're near the gates and they're all jammed together. So the women, and there's definite evidence of the women folk, women being up there on the ramparts with the men. You'll get references to that from time to time. The danger with that is whatever chances, if there had been a storm, of civilians being recognized as, and not, being accorded some sort of rights and not been slaughtered out of hand. If the whole question of the distinction between civilians, unarmed civilians, and armed soldiers, women throwing rocks down on top of you kind of blur that distinction a little bit. But yes, you're absolutely right. There is evidence of the folklore. When investigated, there is, if you like, historical evidence for it having happened.
Wow, that's kind of encouraging. There's some truth in it. I think I've seen a mural in a pub in Limerick, Pádraig, showing the women throwing bottles and stuff at the Williamite troops.
Yeah, well, now I'm married to a Limerick woman, so I'm not going to make any remarks about their bellicosity or whatever. But they're strong women. We'll say that much.
Okay, well, moving on. So there's sieges by assault, which generally or often don't go that well. Then there's sieges which are basically attempts to starve a city out. Can you talk about some examples there?
Well, probably the classic example is, of course, Derry in 1689. And I think Derry is really pivotal. We use this analogy, pivotal. Do you know what a pivot is, John?
A pivot is like a point at which something moves, like a seesaw, say.
It's a seesaw. I just use the analogy because one often thinks about these analogies, and you use a phrase like pivotal. And if you can imagine a seesaw, it's a barrel on the side, and you've got the plank over it, and it's the point of balance, the point at which it can go either way. And Derry, I think, is pivotal in that sense, in that the entire war, James could have, if there hadn't been a siege or if it had been concluded quickly, James was going to land an Irish army in Scotland. There was a significant Scottish Jacobite presence. They had been winning. They'd won at Killiecrankie, or they would win rather later that summer under Bonnie Clavers. That could have transferred the seat of the war onto the island of Britain and very possibly turned the tide of the war against William and his invasion. So Derry is important. What happens? Derry is physically and by nature and by artifice is a very strong and exceptionally strong place. It's got modernized defenses built in the first decades of the 17th century. It's standing on an island, and originally it was the island of the Derry, and what's now the Bogside would have been inaccessible. So it's got, if you like, the foil, both the estuary and the river on the south, the east and the north, and to the west you've got the bog of the Bogside. So it's on this island. What is Derry in 1689, April 1689? Basically, all the northern Protestant forces, the settler armies, have been defeated sequentially. They've been defeated in East Ulster, in Mid Ulster, and in West Ulster at the Battle of the Fords, so that they've all been driven, with the exception of the Enniskillen. The entirety of the civilian, or rather, certainly the military, and to a great extent the civilians of the plantation, are inside those walls. That's it. They're there, and the Williamites, or rather the Jacobites, the Irish, come and they want the city. They don't have enough guns or big enough guns to knock holes in the walls. So it's about 7,000, all things being taken together, maybe 7,000 to 8,000 Jacobites. There's about as many Williamite soldiers, Ulster Protestant soldiers within the walls. So it's an unusual siege in that it's very hard for the Jacobites to get onto the island. They do it twice, but they're beaten off again. But equally, it's very hard for the settlers to get off the island. And they try it twice, and on both occasions, at Pennyburn and later on, they are beaten back. So that it's a stalemate. Neither side can get at the other. So what the Jacobites do is to just sit down and they wait and wait and wait. They block the Foyle estuary, or a part of it, not the but the Foyle River, the narrow part of it, with a boom and with an artillery fortification and guns, and they wait and wait and wait from in April, May, June, well into July. So that's a classic example of starving out the civilians. Famously, I mean, Walker, the governor of the city, writes a rather, if you like, self-promoting history of the siege, in which he gives a price list of the various items towards the end of the siege, and how there was a rat would cost X amount and horse meat was this amount. There was one rather corpulent looking citizen who fancied that people were looking at him very hungrily and hid for a few days. But the problem with Derry was sickness rather than outright starvation. And the problem again has to do with the constricted. There's 20,000 people. Now, if you know Derry, I wish I'd taken the trouble to get the actual dimensions. But the walls, Derry has a square or diamond. It has roads going off each of those squares. So you're standing in the diamond and you can look down at the gates, look uphill a little bit or downhill. You're looking at, I mean, literally, it's not quite a stone's throw, but it's not much more than a stone's throw to each of the gates. So that it's a very small space and you have 20,000 people there. And their water supply is a problem. There are 2 wells within the walls. I saw one of them is still there. It's shown near the Bishop's Quarter Gate, and there's a hotel there, and it's in the back of the hotel. And the water was described as muddy. The only clean water for the civilians and for the soldiers is actually outside the walls, down a hill outside the walls, and they have to run out under fire, get water into the bottle, run back in again. And of course, you'd imagine the Jacobites would have trained their cannon on that spot and that would have realized the danger. So that with the result that there's a shortage of water, people, particularly the civilians, the soldiers probably are doing a little bit better, are drinking contaminated water. And that leads to sickness. And by the time the siege is broken with a relief fleet, the rate of sickness is accelerating. Thus, I mean, there's 7,000 troops inside at the beginning of the siege. By my calculations, by the end, there are 4,300 still alive. Now, that seems like a lot, I suppose, by our standards. But by the standards of contemporary sieges, that's not huge mortality. 7,000 down to just over 4,000 in how many months? 3 months? Yeah, over 3 months. But the rate of sickness was accelerating. Thus, 25th of July, 4,892. 28th of July, 4,300. The rate was getting worse. So yes, sickness is the problem in Derry rather than hunger.
Well, I was going to ask you, Pádraig, as a former military man yourself, when you look through a lot of these sieges, is there any particularly incompetent actions by military commanders that you're reading about and you're thinking, what were they thinking?
Okay, God, I love that moment. All right, yeah, the psychology of military incompetence. My own military experience many years ago, I was in the artillery, so I suppose one does think about sieges. Golly, I hadn't been expecting that question, Carl, and I need to think about it for a second. Yes. I'd have to think about the 1649 siege of Drogheda. That's the one I was discussing. But there was another and far less well-known siege of Drogheda, December 1641, January, February, and March 1642. That is a blockade by Irish insurgents and 3 attempted assaults on the town. So one of those assaults, to my mind, was an egregiously piece of incompetence. Why? Because some kindly townspeople had made a hole in the wall for the insurgents. So they're sent in, the guys sneak in through the wall, and they're lucky, or not lucky, they've done it the night. They know that the garrison has been celebrating that particular night. So the garrison, the English troops are all, what's the word? They're all drunk. They're all asleep with drink taken. So they're in this town. Nearly all the very few soldiers are awake and sober. They've emerged into it, and they seem to emerge on the street, and then they don't really know what are they supposed to do next. You know what I mean? So obviously, nobody told them go and open up the doors or the gates and let in everybody else. Instead of which they shout Clan Pádraig, or their rallying cry, and they wake everybody up, and then the soldiers wake up, get over their drink and come out and chase them out through the hole in the wall. There's a lot of casualties inflicted on the attackers, and really you got to wonder, had anybody given them instructions as to what to do? A little map saying, when you go through the wall, turn left, turn right, and go to the gate, or whatever. I'm sure if I thought long and hard about it, there would be other, even more egregious ones, but that one always sticks in my mind.
And I suppose the corollary, or the opposite, is what's the best siege from a technical point of view in Ireland at that period?
Oh, I think my favourite in that sense is it's a little doozy, is the siege of Duncannon in January, February, March of 1645. That is a siege. Duncannon is a fort in Waterford Harbour. It dominates almost completely the harbour. So if you can imagine, the Confederate Catholics control maybe 2/3 of Ireland, but their enemies, who owe allegiance to the English Parliament, control Duncannon Fort, which means that the very important ports, Waterford and Ross in particular, they have great difficulty in their trade. So eventually, the Confederate Catholics, under a man called Thomas Preston, they lay siege to it. And it's a perfect example of, albeit a small-scale siege. Duncannon, it's on a promontory, it's got a landward side, it's got bastions, it's got very thick defences, it's got lots of guns, and Preston uses the entire panoply of the modern siege. He uses sapping, he uses parallels, in other words, approach trenches and trenches going across, joining them, which to my mind is the first time anybody ever did that. That's usually associated with Vauban. So he's quite innovative in that sense. His gunners are very good. They're able to knock out the parliamentary shipping that's trying to relieve the town. They're able to use mortars. Again, the first time I think mortars are used. These are high range, not high range, but high angle fire dropping bombs over walls and into a fortified place. So they use mortars, they use saps, parallels, very accurate gunnery, and they suffer relatively light casualties. I mean, we're talking about 12 to 20 men killed during that process. So it's very economical on time, on lives, and technically very innovative. Now, having said that about Thomas Preston, he did a very good siege. He was egregiously incompetent battlefield commander. He would do things that you couldn't believe, putting cavalry into narrow little borings, putting the wrong formations in the wrong place. Every time he ran a battle, he made a complete dog's dinner of it.
Yeah, Dungan's Hill would be the.
We didn't go at Dungan's Hill, Timahoe, Ross. You could go on. You got to wonder. That's another one. I mean, was anybody keeping an eye on this guy and say, right, what's going to happen there? But in any event, you asked me about the siege. Preston's siege of Duncannon was absolutely spot on.
Pádraig, it strikes me as odd that in this whole century of blood and sieges in Ireland, the 17th century, that Dublin, the capital, isn't really besieged at all.
Yeah, the nearest we get to a siege of Dublin is in November 1646. A joint army of Owen O'Neill's Ulster Army and Thomas Preston's Leinster Army. They advance separately. One camps at Leixlip, the other camps at, I think, near Newcastle and County Kildare. Between camp followers and troops, 20,000 people. That's a big operation, but they don't go any closer to Dublin than that. Then you have the siege of Dublin by Ormond in 1649. So Dublin is closely besieged there. And what goes wrong for Ormond? The problem with taking Dublin is that it's a town on a river. This is a common problem in the siege. So you then have to split your army. And if you can imagine Dublin, aside from the bridge over Dublin, what's the next crossing point? If you go upriver from Dublin, what's the next crossing point you could reliably send troops across? I'm not asking this as a sort of a rhetorical question. I'm not 100% sure myself, but I think it would be maybe Leixlip. Would I be right?
At that time, probably, possibly. Like the Kilmainham would be a common crossing point, I suppose.
I don't know. It was Kilmainham. Kilmainham had mills, so there was a good flow of water there. So I'm not sure that maybe it is that far. But
Chapel is it possibly? I'm not sure though.
Yeah, I'm not sure myself. But certainly a crossing point is well up, which means that let's say you have the parliamentarians of 10,000 men under Jones inside in the city. Then Ormond would need 10,000 men on each side of the city just to have equal numbers, if you follow what I'm saying. So in any event, Ormond decided on his preparations for an attack, and he captured his troops captured a place called Baggot Rat, which is on modern day Baggot Street, which would have been outside the city walls in those days. And having done that in night operation, he went back to have his breakfast and go and catch up on his beauty sleep. And as he slept, his camp was overrun by Jones's parliamentarians. So the Battle of Rathmines is in fact associated with the siege of Dublin. So in fact, there are two sieges, one almost siege and one in 1649 that was an actual siege. Now the Jacobites, before and after the Boyne, don't seem to have considered defending Dublin. Why? Because for them, defending Dublin, the walls of Dublin, as one of them put it, is the River Boyne. So they decide they're going to defend Dublin on the River Boyne. It's a lot of a far out defence that there's no point in defending it closer, because Dublin at that stage is not. Its walls are ruinous, and such is the scale of urban development, most of the town is in fact outside the walls. So it is an open and to a great extent indefensible city.
I mean, yeah, Rathmines is just up the road from where I'm speaking from now, Pádraig, and people can never believe when you tell them there was a Battle of Rathmines. Moving on.
Rathmines is where Ormond had his camp. That's why we call it it's the Battle of Rathmines, when the camp was overrun. So I always find it strange to imagine that Baggot Rat or Baggot Street, and you read about earlier in the 1640s the Burns and the O'Tooles raiding from County Wicklow, taking cattle from near Baggot Rat. So literally within a stone's throw almost of Dublin Castle, the frontier was right there, that close to Dublin.
Moving on, I want to kind of close out the chronology. I mean, after the Limerick surrenders to the Williamites in 1691, that is really the last great siege in Irish history, isn't it?
It is. It's because the age of siege work has finished. And I suppose in the sieges I mentioned, one I hadn't mentioned, and it is kind of sui generis. And given I'm originally an Athlone man myself, and I suppose to my mind, the biggest siege of all in terms of expenditure, earlier that year, the crossing of the Shannon, Aughrim, and then the second siege of Limerick. Athlone in June 1691 is a perfect example of the Dutch method of attack, of siege. The Dutch, and to a lesser extent the English, lay huge emphasis on blitzkrieg, as it were, on firepower. And they use an inordinate amount of firepower. And in the case of Athlone, given the small size of the Connacht side of the town, that sustains over 10 days 12,000 shot, 600 bombs, any amount of stones, which, if you knew the small size of the footprint of that side of town, is a very intense bombardment. So that, and ultimately, the Williamites win because, and Ginkel in charge of wins because he's able to force the Irish not to occupy that space. They have to pull back most of their troops, barring a skeleton crew near the river, which means that he can push his people across the river by a nearby ford. Now, that and the second siege of Limerick, which was not by any means a walkover. There was a great deal. Ginkel attacks the English town, he fails. He attacks the Irish town, he fails. He is coming round by County Clare, and there's a battle at Thomond Bridge, and he thinks he's failed. He thinks that's it. He writes to Dublin saying, "We're going to be here for another winter, boys." And then the Irish come out and say, "We'd like to talk about talks," and that's the end of the war. I can't think of anything that happens after Limerick 1691 that's remotely like the kind of siege that we're talking about.
Yeah, like there's no sieges in 1798 to speak of.
No, 1798, you have the attempted capture of New Ross. They assault it, they take the gates, the walls. They don't manage to take the main square, which is covered by artillery. And to that extent, I suppose, that's not a siege. It's more like an assault. There's nothing prolonged about it, but it's certainly a contested action in a built-up area. So it's pretty analogous, I suppose, to a siege. But isn't that pretty much it, really, from 1798 and thereafter?
Yeah, as far as I can think. I mean, the city and the town in the 18th century becomes something else. I think it's fair to say, isn't it? I mean, it's not a fortified settlement anymore. It's something else.
Well, all of those walls that I'm talking about are overtaken by corporations. Try and keep the walls going. Remember, in the 18th century, there's the constant fear of a French descent with the Wild Geese, with a Irish Jacobite army transporting the French Navy, transporting Irish troops to a landing in Munster or Connacht. So the Munster, Limerick, Galway particularly, tried to keep their walls intact throughout the 18th century. But certainly after Culloden, after the 1740s, it becomes more and more of a wasted effort. Ubernashka, they don't keep up the walls. So the walls are gradually built up against, holes are made in them. They become degraded. And the cities expand beyond that belt of fortifications. So the walls lose their relevance. And in most cases, they don't survive. There's only fragments survive into the 19th, and even fewer fragments into the 20th century. How many fragments survive of Dublin's walls?
No, there's one fragment really intact on Cook Street, and that's it.
That's what I was thinking. No, that's the only one I can think of. And in the case of Limerick, around St. John's Hospital, the Irish town, oddly enough, where all the fighting happened, the walls around on either side of that breach are actually still quite intact, and you can see the gate, St. John's Gate. I think this is so cool. You can stand outside and look at St. John's Gate, and you can still see the holes and where the cannonballs must have hit the outer gate. So that's kind of cool. You see that. Galway would have had, or should have had, certainly into the 1960s, it had one of its major bastions, Lyons Tower Bastion, enormously impressive, very solid looking thing. But what survived Coote and Cromwell did not survive the rapacity of the Galway builder, of which we need say no more.
Yeah, I mean, I lived in Galway for a little while, and what is fascinating that there's actually a section of city wall preserved in a shopping centre, though, which had been underground, I think.
I wonder about I'm open to correction. I wonder how accurate was that reconstruction of that wall there. But certainly the wall is reconstructed on the basis. If you look at the before, the wall as it was and the wall as it's reconstructed, I think it's rougher looking. the stone doesn't fit as closely together. But yes, it was an imaginative way of presenting and representing the walls. And more's the pity that, if you like, the others end of it on Eglinton Street hadn't survived, and nothing is left there of that now at all. They didn't even keep the stones or number the stones. But then the same applies at Lone, just the smallest fragments. As I say, Limerick. Anybody who's interested in this has got to walk the circuit of Derry's walls, and you get a feeling for a place that was fortified and that was attacked.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I happened to walk the walls of Derry once, and of course they have a great significance in Derry for the apprentice boys and for people of unionist persuasion, with the idea of no surrender and so on, which dates back to the siege, although I suspect that the commemorations might have started at a later date. Pádraig, did they?
The famously the no surrender dates back to the siege itself. When did the apprentice boys, I think, are early 19th century, but I'm open to correction on that. But certainly the walls themselves, the geography, you get a good sense of the geography of the siege. You can walk around them. How long would you'd walk the entire circuit in, I think, 10 minutes, 12 minutes. That's how small it is. But it's remarkably well preserved, and the cannons are still mounted on it. And it makes it the only equivalent I've seen. Berwick in England has a similarly impressive, that's on the Anglo-Scottish border. That's the nearest I've come to seeing a complete circuit of intact and not reconstructed, not pretend, not gussied up, real fortifications.
Yes, Pádraig, I was going to ask you, can you think of any sieges in the modern era that sort of conform almost to what we're talking about, the 17th century Irish sieges?
Oh, well, I suppose you'd have to say Siege of Leningrad. I mean, if you talk, do you count the Second World War as modern?
Yes.
Yeah.
I think more so even in the more recent period as well, when we're looking at things like Syria and so on.
Yeah,
It seems that the siege has really made a comeback.
Aleppo and Homs. That's right. Those modern sieges are a function of the reluctance of armies to get sucked into street fighting. They want to stand off and shell them, drop artillery on them, encourage civilians, drive out the civilian population. But the idea of going on a street by street, clearing out of these places, is it's very unattractive for armies to take heavy casualties. And a lot of the time, these sieges last so long, it's not so much they could take them if they're prepared to take the casualties. In the 17th century siege, William, when he's attacking Limerick, is prepared as he was going to have a second go. Even though he'd lost 1,500 men, he was going to go at it again. But the weather turned and he was running low on cannon shot. In those sieges you're talking about, in the Syrian civil war, I think the reluctance of the Syrian, of Assad's people, to take take heavy casualties in getting involved is the main explanation for the length, the duration of these sieges. What do you think? I wouldn't swear to it now, but that's my own impression.
I think we see as well that you don't have the seasonal nature to the sieges as well that you would have had in the early modern period. They're sort of relentless.
Well, again, usually a siege ends in winter, October, November, because the attackers it's very difficult for them to stay encamped in the open during a winter. They're going to get resupply is going to be difficult. Setting up their guns in a quagmire is more difficult. But it happens. You do get year-round sieges. I mean, as I said, that example, the Spanish siege of Ostend, that goes on summer and winter, but they pay a price. So, but that's a commonplace of. I mean, modern warfare is so much more intense in the sense that it's not only is the seasonal aspect, but the diurnal aspect is taken out of it. If you could imagine early modern warfare, everything stops when it gets dark. Nearly everything stops when it gets dark. Any attempt to do military operations after dark, usually a disaster. Whereas nowadays you've got the 24-hour battlefield. You have troops. The biggest enemy is lack of sleep. They're kept going. And this is true right back to the Second World War, where and particularly now with night vision equipment and various other infrared imaging and various other ways of fight, of literally you can actually fight at night in a way that just wouldn't have been possible in those days.
I think we leave it there. So, Pádraig, thanks very much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, and thank you, Cathal.
Thank you very much, Pádraig. And that was Pádraig Lenihan from the National University of Ireland, Galway. If you'd like to listen to this or previous episodes of the show, please go to our website, irishhistoryshow.ie. You can follow us on Twitter @IrishHistoryPod or follow us on Facebook, facebook.com/The Irish History Show. My name is Cathal Brennan, and on behalf of myself and my co-host John Dorney, thank you very much for listening.